Welcome, everyone. My name is Liz Farley-Ripple. I am a co-PI for the Center for Research, Use, and Education. I'm joined with many members of our team, including Henry Debbie Mix, and Dr. Katie Tilley, who will be co-facilitating today's webinar with me. Today's session is the third in a four-part series in which our center is collaborating with SRI to think about ways that we strengthen the relationship between research and practice. And so we started this partnership as a way to think about how the lessons we've learned from our center over the last 7 years might be useful to members of the SRI community, members of the larger research community, in thinking about how we can be more impactful. In the first session, we shared some findings and provoked some discussion questions. Then we had a session with my colleague, Samantha Shevchuk, who shared a bit about the idea of knowledge mobilization and what that looks like from the research perspective. In today's session, we're focusing on one of the findings, multiple findings from across our work, themes that reemerge at every corner. And that's the idea of research needing to be actionable and compatible. Actionable being educators, leaders, policymakers understand what they can do or what they should do based on the findings of research, and compatibility being a sort of way of thinking about fit and relevance. And there's a lot of terms we throw under the ideas, but we're going to use the word actionability and compatibility today. So our goal is to think about those things in terms of how we can meet the research needs of educators. So our agenda for today is to hear just a brief bit about CREW, our findings regarding actionability and compatibility. We're going to anchor this in some of the data that we've collected over the last several years. And then we're going to hear from a panel, the most important panel we're going to have in this series. And those are folks that are on the ground, using research, sharing research, engaging in improvement efforts, making decisions. And we really need to hear from them in order to understand how to make our research more useful. And then we'll end with a Q&A. So we'll have time to interact and discuss these ideas. Before I jump into our background on CREW, I'd like to introduce our panel, let you know who's here. And they all in my window here, if you guys could just give a wave. We have Raya Steele here. She's been a special educator in Idaho. She's been teaching for about 20 years, and I had the pleasure of meeting her a couple years, well, actually my colleague has met her for a couple of years back, and we're really excited that joining us from the teacher perspective. We've got Kathy Hayes, who is with the Los Angeles Unified School District here, and she works with the National Network of Educational Research Practice Partnerships. We have Christina Alois here, who has been a colleague and a friend over the years here in Delaware. She is now serving as the superintendent of the Cesar Rodney School District, and we're excited to have her here. And then the esteemed Kim Marshall, author of the Marshall Memo, who has grown from a teacher to a leader to a central office administrator to a key broker of research to school districts globally. All right, so before we hear from them, we want to take a few minutes to anchor why we're talking about this in some of our findings. So our center, the Center for Research, Use, and Education, is funded by the Institute for Education Sciences as a knowledge utilization center. And through a series of research projects that include large-scale surveys, case studies, as well as outreach, engagement, and advocacy work, we've been really trying to rethink research for schools, so R4S. And we've been looking at both the production of research from the research side, which is why we're talking to you guys, as well as the ways in which research informs school improvement efforts. So some of the findings we're going to share today come from these different parts of our research project. We have the survey of evidence in education. The school version was administered to instructional staff from 134 schools, more than 4,000 educators. We've done some case studies of what we call deep use schools, and those are ones that engaged with research in particular ways based on their responses to the survey. And brokerage case studies, where we traced research that was used for decision making, and then trace its path all the way back to research. So across all of these elements, we've learned quite a bit about different perspectives, different processes. And so we, are here to share a bit about that today. So I'm going to jump in here and let Katie take over, and she's going to share about this first key finding about actionability.
Thanks, Liz. So yes, as Liz said, across all of our data sources, this is one of the major key findings that we found, is that educators prefer to use research resources that are actionable. And we saw this in our case studies. Across individuals and across schools, it was very clear that educators value research that they can put into action more than research that needs additional translation. And as demonstrated by the quotes on this slide, we can see that educators in our study expressed a desire for resources that provide clear, explicit steps that they can take in the classroom, with statements like, we want ideas that we can implement right now in our classroom. Or I guess a thing that we look for, is it going to be easily applicable? We don't do things that are a waste of time. And this sentiment was echoed in our survey data as well. So in the SEAS data related to educators' perspectives, we saw that over 80% of respondents indicated that actionability was important, or a very important characteristic of research products. And then similarly, they rated other characteristics related to usability, like it's easy to understand or provides a demonstration of findings and model strategies, as important also. And then if we look to the left side of the screen on that figure there, we can see that in general, survey respondents had positive attitudes about the actionability of education research, with more than 80% of respondents indicating that they agree or strongly agree with the statement that most education research suggests actionable steps to take in practice. SEAS data also support this idea of the value of actionability when we look at the actual products and resources that practitioners reported using to inform their practice. The data revealed that there's an overwhelming preference for practitioner-oriented professional resources, and these are things like professional development materials or books, over traditional research products like peer-reviewed journal articles or reports. So as the earlier qualitative data allude to, traditional research products are often viewed as requiring additional translation in order to be usable. And then finally, from our brokerage study, we learned that practitioners prefer resources that are prescriptive in nature rather than descriptive. So in these case studies, we were interested in exploring the different characteristics of the different products that were found in each case. And we explored things like the product type and product format. And our findings align with the findings just presented, namely that practitioners prefer resources targeted to their needs. And used books and professional learning opportunities to obtain evidence-based resources. And I'll hand it back over to Liz for our second key finding.
Great. The second key finding I want to focus on in our conversation today pertains to this idea of compatibility. And I'm going to use the word compatibility because relevance is sort of to wrap our heads around. Fit also feels abstract. So when we're thinking about compatibility, we're sort of thinking about this umbrella of how is this a good fit for my classroom, my school, my district? Do we have the resources to implement this? What's the larger match between what the research is asking of us and our needs, our goals, our resources, et cetera? So this is the idea underlying compatibility. So this shows up in our data in a number of ways. In our case studies, we hear specific characteristics, right? Local context, what does it match the school? Will it fit for our teachers and their current skill set, what they're available to do, the number of teachers we have, and of course, students, right? So a lot of conversations focused on, we have to keep our population in mind. Is this going to be a good fit for where our students are? Even some cases, right, are really thinking about some of those geographical differences. In fact, I think in the larger ed community, we've talked about a lot of research being done in these very big districts and urban areas, right? And does that help, and is that relevant for smaller school districts or rural school districts, right? So this idea of local context comes up in a number of places. We also see this idea of local compatibility sort of bubble up when we think about the kinds of information that folks are using to inform decisions. And when we asked about the different kinds of evidence that influence decisions, at the top, we really see these local sources of information, right? Informal data collected by staff, advice from local leaders, formal analysis of local data. And while this suggests some really interesting things about the kinds of evidence that are valued, the local nature of it really reinforces that the context matters and that the information we're using has to help us understand or be useful in our current situation. We also see when we asked them about when they did use research, a little bit more about the kind of research they were using. And we see that people tend to report using research that has been done on or with communities that look like theirs, whether demographically, geographically, or in terms of achievement profile. And we see less use of things that tend to be widely generalizable or need to be nationally representative. There is this sort of evaluation for local relevance. This is sort of echoed when we asked folks where they turn to for education research. Very few turn directly to traditional research resources like peer-reviewed journals or researchers themselves. And the vast majority really rely on this, other kinds of information and resources within their local school community. Again, so this reinforces that the importance of educators using evidence that is locally relevant. And again, we go back to some of these case studies and we see here that these concepts are very important. They pertain to credibility as well, right? So local can be both geographic, it can be professional. People with prior experience in my school are able to share with me the kinds of information that I will need in my classroom. So these themes bubble up in a number of places, again, in the brokerage case studies, where this is a great example. When they're thinking about a particular problem they're addressing, they're thinking about their staff needs. And so they identified an article that was actually a perfect match to those needs, right? So really thinking about that local compatibility. So sorry, I didn't mean to mute myself. I meant to stop my share. So we wanted to focus on those two pieces because they bubble up across all of our work. And they are, at the same time they are sort of maybe obvious, it's also unclear how we, as members of the research community, can be responsive to that. So in our first workshop in this series, we provoked that question. We said, what would it take for our research to be actionable or relevant? What would we need to make our research more useful? And so we created this Jamboard as a way of collecting some of those ideas and that information. I'm going to actually put that Jamboard back in our chat right now. So folks can take a second to read it, and I'd like to open it up for further contributions, right? Not everyone that was in our first session is here today. Some of the folks that are here today were not in our first session. So let's ask that question together. What does it mean for research to be actionable or compatible? And what strategies might we use? This is a little bit of a view to think about ideas, strategies. How have you done this? And then after that, we're going to hear directly from our panel. So I'm going to give you about 2 minutes to review, to drop some new ideas in, and to give some thought to those questions. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Oop. And please let me know if you're having any difficulty using the Jamboard. We can always, oh, and you can put them anywhere. They're not organized for a particular purpose. I see folks in the Jamboard, but I don't see a lot of posting. But I'm going to leave that's open. Please feel free to drop things in as we continue with our time. But now I would like to, get to the heart of the matter. The reason why we're all here is to really hear from our esteemed panel. So we're going to turn to a more open conversation, and Katie's going to kick off with a question that will let our panelists share a little bit about themselves.
So we wanted you to tell us about a piece of research that's been valuable to you and why. Or tell us about a time that you used research and about the research that you used. And we're going to start off with Raya and then go to Kathy, if that's okay. So Raya, if you could share with us a story or an anecdote, from a time that you used research, and tell us a little bit about that research.
Sure. I teach special education. I co-teach in a general education classroom as well, K-6. So a lot of my research has to do with special education and closing the gap and trying to maintain in a general education setting. So dyslexia is like my thing. So brain-based research is kind of where I nerd out on. So there's a lot of change happening with that, which is so exciting. So keeping up is a little difficult, but really for me, kind of like going back to how Liz kind of explained everything, it's hard to go to the heart of the researchers telling you what's happening with brain-based. So I go to the stories that educators are then telling, Lice, Prudis and Squid, and those kind of the books that were put together based on brain-based research for dyslexia. The exciting thing with when I take it to my students is then I can take it to my parents. And I think that's been pretty exciting to be able to be that intermediary of being like, okay, you understand dyslexia, you understand all the steps, you understand the brain-based development of it, then what do I do to help a child, right? And how do I help the parents understand that dyslexia is not BD reversals and all I need to do is just go ahead and just fix that all up and then their children will be readers, that it's so much more. It's 100 hours of intervention before the certain parts of their brain are starting to fire, that their neurons have to retrace. So all of those kind of things that I think really helps the parents then understand what I'm doing, which then allows more growth for me, which also gives me more time. And so I think that partnership with bringing something like dyslexia brain-based research into my classroom with the teachers as well as with the student and then to the parent has really been beneficial. We are all high schools are all graduating this week, and I had multiple of my students come back that because I've been teaching here so long, that are graduating high school headed off to college with dyslexia. And I think the big part of that is bridging the reality of the research to the parents, almost more so than me directly teaching the kids. So yeah, that's one of the many aspects.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Kathy, did you have a story?
Oh, I have lots of stories. When you have somebody with the hair color of mine, we usually have too many stories. But I was reflecting that I was really happy to see that we had a teacher in a room, but then I see that our teacher in the room is really a really good researcher teacher in the room. So not the kind of teacher that I might be trying to reach, but the story I wanted to tell was actually, I came to LAUSD in the year 2000, and I thought I had died and gone to heaven because I'm a researcher of English learners, and I was handed a project to study structured English immersion, which was a new project, a new initiative in the district after the death of bilingual education. And so I, as a qualitative researcher, could ask the question, what is the nature of structured English immersion? Because nobody knew. And I won't tell you guys all about the whole history, but as a result of our research, we were able to tell the district, you were not implementing the program. You were not implementing English language development. We went to 180 classrooms and we did deep research for 5 years. And that was one of our major findings. And after 3 years, they were like, oh, well, we have to implement English language development for our English learners. And so they did a turnaround. They started English language development institutes and required that every teacher taught it, every elementary teacher. So that was a very happy side effect of our work as researchers within the district. Now those halcyon days were over in the year, I started in the year 2000, they ended by the year 2009. Politics and budget killed the research evaluation department in LAUSD, and it's only recently been revived. So we went a good 15 years with no research, no evaluation. I always complain that people just threw the project against the wall and watched it slide down and try to decide if that was a good project or not. So we have many cases of researchers working with us to try to help the district, most of which we don't see any effect in the classrooms. Because, it's a big bureaucracy, a big district, and the researchers that I work with work mostly with decision makers, not with teachers, not even with principals. But there is a new project that I'd like to mention that UCLA is doing with us, and they are in their EDD project. The director of that program came to me and said, what about if our EDD students did dissertations that actually address the needs of the district? What a concept. Oh my goodness. So we're doing a pilot. We have 4 graduate students, and they have on their committee a district person and a university person, and they are co-creating the research questions based on the needs of the district. So it's going to take a couple of years to see what the findings are and how they help the district, and then maybe another couple of years to see if it actually made a difference. But I'm pretty excited about that project.
Oh, that's awesome. That sounds really exciting, the pilot. I'll be looking forward to hearing more about that. Christine, turn to you now. If you have a story of a time that you've used research, to tell us a little bit about that piece of research.
Absolutely. Kathy, I just have to tell you a little shout out to UD where I finished my doctorate. That's a large part of our program, was looking at problems right within the districts that we were working in and researching them. So hopefully you'll see the same amazing results with that. So hi, everybody. It's very nice to see you all this afternoon. And, I have somewhat of a unique perspective. I spent 24 years in a school district, actually the one that I'm the superintendent of right now. And then I left for 3.5 years. I was appointed as the Deputy Secretary of Education for Delaware. So it just happened to be 1 year before the pandemic started. And so as you can imagine, on the first day of shutdown, we immediately all jumped on and started looking for research. What were we going to do? Every system that we had ever known of was now imploded, and we had to find the best way to move forward. First thinking we had 2 weeks out of school, and then moving almost to 2 years. So what I wanted to share today was less of what research we found and more of what research we couldn't find. We had a very difficult time looking for research that, as the entire intro to this session today explained, was actionable, was something that in a time of a pandemic and when we had an emergency and we had to immediately change things and implement, we didn't necessarily have the resources that we felt like we needed in order to immediately jump into a new way of doing things. And UD was phenomenal. I had several calls with Liz and many others that are on this call, kind of reaching out and looking, what do we do now that everything's virtual? Where is there research on the amount of time students should be spent on screen? Where is there research on social, emotional, behavioral wellness, interventions that we can provide remotely to families? So, my story today is, how can we now take the 2 years that we went through and really work together to come up with some amazing research that can now inform the future for needed things that we never thought we would have ever had to, even begin to address in education. I can also say that, a lot of times we do not have a research department at the Delaware Department of Education. So we do rely heavily on the University of Delaware, and many of our education associates are, deeply into researching on their own while also creating, implementing, monitoring, et cetera. So we often, rely very heavily on our IHEs, our professional organizations, so, and quite frankly, Kim, I was so excited when I saw that your name was on here, because being a former in the district too, your Marshall Memo was something that we subscribed to for all of our specialists in the district. And so when everyone heard you were going to be here, researchers are rock stars for educators. So, that's the kind of research that we kind of navigate to. The research we use in the districts now, and we also use at DOE, were things like John Hattie's work with the meta-analysis, where lots of information, very similar to what, Marshall Memo brings all this information together for us. They need something that's put in front of them in the small chunks that have the, overarching, what is the actionable piece that you want us to do? And then not only that, how am I going to make that happen right away in my classroom? And for me now as a superintendent and looking at strategic planning, how am I going to use that research in order to choose the areas that we're going to focus on? And again, we always say evidence-based, research-based, but how are we getting that strong evidence-based, research-based information in order to do that? And unfortunately, sometimes I see that we might rely more on programs that are research-based, et cetera, rather than the actual research behind it and the expertise within the district. So, everything that was shared in the beginning is so relevant. Visuals are so important for educators, infographics, things of that nature. And at DOE, any reports that we did do with CRESP, we always had some type of infographic to go out as well. So again, just a practical is the word, practical and immediate. And I just appreciate the support that we received from our fellow researchers at UD throughout the past 3 years and hopefully moving forward.
Thank you, Christine. Definitely moving forward. Kim?
So Christine, I'm delighted that the Marshall Memo has been helpful. So I have 3 stories about research that are pretty brief. First of all, when I was a 6th grade teacher in Boston, I'd been in the classroom for 8 or 9 years, I read in the New York Times a story about Ron Edmonds's research on effective schools, the difference between schools with similar populations, some much more effective than others. And around the same time, a British study came out, 15,000 Hours, a book by Rudder and others, sort of with the same kind of message about what is the secret sauce of schools that are highly effective, especially for children of color, children of poverty. These changed my life. These 2 studies, once I got into the real research, I went back, studied actually with Ron Edmonds the year before he died at Harvard, and then became a principal. Eventually, it took a few years to get into the principal's job. So that's obsessed me, is what are the ways that principals spend their time that actually make a difference to teaching and learning. So that's the first story. The second story is about the moment in Barack Obama's administration, quite early on, when several educators went into the Oval Office and convinced him and Arnie Duncan that using test scores was a good way to evaluate teachers. They had this value-added research, which showed with statistical maps with all these Greek letters and everything, very, very impressive, that you could actually hold an individual teacher accountable for their students' learning. Unfortunately, the policymakers were a little bit preoccupied with economic collapse and other things that were going on, and they didn't ask that key question of the researchers: how reliable is this at the individual teacher level? Actually, the researchers knew the answer to that question. It's a confidence interval of about between 35 and 53%. I mean, extremely unreliable. And it's sort of a scandal in education that the federal government then bought into this, made it a key factor in Race to the Top. 42 states made student results a key factor in teachers' evaluation, and went down this rabbit hole, which now we found out is all completely ineffective. So it was a real educational research disaster, partly because the policymakers didn't ask the right questions and didn't slow the process down. That's the second story. The third story is the current war that's going on around the science of reading. And Henry is involved in this, knows all about it much more than I do. But I'm struggling with the Marshall Memo and with my tens of thousands of readers all around the world to give them the straight stuff about this, to give them clear, actionable, useful, and unbiased information about what exactly is the story about phonics, what is the story about knowledge, what is the story about instruction in the early grades, what lasts into the upper grades and what doesn't. It's really, and it's become, as Henry said a few minutes ago before he got started, highly politicized. There are some very effective advocates on one side of this issue, and it's a mess. If I were an elementary principal right now, I would be shaking my head trying to figure out, what am I going to do? Which program am I going to dump reading recovery? And all these questions. So those are, and by the way, I do want to say quickly that there is a role in the world for basic research, for theoretical research that does not have immediate actionability. I mean, think of physics, think of economics, think of political science. I mean, think of the atom bomb. I mean, that took, decades and decades of basic research. So there's a role for that. And if anyone's on the call who's doing research that isn't immediately actionable, don't feel bad. Yours may pay off in the long run, but this subject for today is actionability.
Thank you so much. It's really interesting to hear from the perspective of a broker who's trying to, yourself pick out, how do I translate this and make it meaningful? So thank you so much, all of you, for sharing.
So I'm going to piggyback and break down this conversation just a little bit more, because stories, I think, are really helpful. They set the stage, they give the background, they give us a feel for what you're doing with research and how we as researchers can sort of fit into those processes. But I want to dig in a little bit more to these two ideas. So I'm going to kick off by asking you guys a little bit more about the kinds of information you need to, I guess I'm going to phrase this a little bit awkwardly, to evaluate whether research is locally compatible or relevant, right? So what are those criteria? So Christine threw a couple of things out, right? Practical and immediate. And, Kim spoke a bit about trying, right? We have often conflicting findings in research, and we have advocacy, and it's these things that, Raya's talking about, right? I need, using research in a way that helps teachers and parents to understand particular issues with children. So, and Kathy, your example is very fascinating, because you're doing research, you're doing that locally compatible research, and you have partners that are doing some of that work too. So to get a little more brass tacks, what does it look like for something to be, I'll pick on Christine first, because she won't be mad at me. What does it mean to be like practical or immediate? Like what does that, like in real terms, when you're reading something or you're searching for something or you're talking to someone, what's your cue?
Yeah, that's great. That's a great question. And I think as you're talking, the one thing that, I felt both at the department and now back here in the district is that every decision we make with research immediately sets a lot of things in motion. It sets purchasing, it sets professional learning, it sets time spent, on something. And it directly impacts children immediately and can have long lasting effects. So I think I think what would be helpful and what we look for is when there's actual concrete examples of something being implemented within like scenarios per se, that we can say, okay, with this research, this is where this was implemented. Basically what Kathy's saying, where she's getting real data in real time with these programs and happening. So that's something that we look for, is where has it been implemented and where have we seen success happen? And then where can we maybe take ways that it was implemented and lessons they've learned from their research to also then, kind of piggyback off of and even make better within our own setting. So that's how I'd begin, by saying we look for somewhat of scenarios where that research has been implemented.
Well, I can pick on more on the panel, but if anyone on the panel would like to jump in and sort of build on that, go for it. Ray, did you just raise your hand? Go for it.
I know, the teacher mode. I'll go real specific just so that we have a specific example of, so you read research on, for example, suicide rate with our LGBTQ community in schools, okay? And you have these numbers and you have the facts, right? And then as a classroom teacher, the district that you work for is not taking the research that is very specific and doing what I would consider enough with it, right? So that's a very specific example. And I think that's just another hurdle that it's like, okay, you have this number, you have this suicide rate, right? Nobody wants to, no, we don't want to be, we don't, you know, we try to get that to zero. And then you just don't have necessarily the support potentially that you're looking for. So that would be a very specific thing of almost like the flip side of it is when, what do you do with the information and you really can't do much beyond what you're able to do in your classroom or your school.
Well, I wasn't going to talk about that, but I would mention that we have that, for example, we have a school experience survey, which, you know, isn't a great survey, but it's institutionalized and every stakeholder in the district is invited to take it. So all the staff, all the students from fourth grade up, and all the parents. And we have pretty high response rates for our staff and our students because they're captive. They have to take it at school. And the parents are not so great. But, you know, before the pandemic, we would get maybe 60% parent response rate. But we were not allowed to ask the students in elementary school what their sexual orientation was. And we kind of had to fight a little bit to even get it to ask the middle school students that question. So we do live in a political world where decisions are made partially on research, but more so on expedience and will it fly and budgets. And, you know, we have a new superintendent. He has his own stuff that he wants to make happen. And he has to learn a lot. He came from Florida, a right to work state with, I don't think there was a teachers union, to LAUSD in Los Angeles, with a very strong teachers union who pretty much dictates a lot of what happens. So, and I talked about the halcyon days because that ended in 2009 and I haven't done research for the district since then. I have been a broker of research and the gatekeeper for research. And what I was going to talk about was we get a lot of proposals. We get them from whom I lovingly call the Beltway Bandits, all those private nonprofits that do research on behalf of the government, and many of which are located in Washington, D.C. We do them from professors, either seeking tenure or working on a book or something. We get requests from graduate students, many of whom are our employees. And for every one of those projects, I made a policy during the pandemic that somebody whom I call in program, I don't consider myself in program, I consider myself an evaluator, researcher outside of program, but anybody in program, a decision maker had to sign off on that research project saying it was of interest and benefit to the district that this research be done. And those people that are making that decision are not teachers and they're not principals. They are bureaucrats. They're higher on the food chain. They are sitting in places where they've all come up. They've been teachers, they've been administrators, they've been, you know, they've walked the walk. And but they're deciding this is a research project of interest to my department. So the director of special education she looks at the proposals and she tells me, and we have to sign off on the proposal. Me and my staff, we review them for the methodological expertise and the burden. Like we don't like graduate students to do big surveys. They want to do them and they come from a variety of institutions, some of which get really a lot of support from their professors and others of which get no support from their professors. And yet they are our staff, so we feel a little obligated to try to work with them. Anyway, the point is we do ask somebody in the district, is it actionable? I don't know if they ask themselves that question. The research project is of interest to that decision maker. And if they sign off on it, we permit it to happen.
You said very clearly that it has to be perceived as actionable, but what about situations where people don't know what they don't know, where they actually should be thinking about something? I'm thinking of two examples of that. First of all, school opening time. It's pretty clear right now that no high school and middle school should open before 8:30 in the morning.
Right.
And that research is being ignored by a lot of people because of athletic programs, students working after school, parent inconvenience, and so forth. The other issue that really is close to my heart is teacher evaluation. There was a big flurry of interest in that a few years ago. Now everyone is tired of it, extremely cynical. and not paying any attention to the very clear research that what we've been doing doesn't work. And my calculation, this is very, very sophisticated statistics here. My calculation is that using conventional teacher evaluation processes, principals spend 17 full days of the school year on a process that people regard as pretty much worthless, no value add at all. So it's the equivalent of locking the principal in a dungeon for 17 days. That's what you're doing. Now, if it's a bad principal, that of course is something you would want to do, but hopefully you don't have any bad principals. So those are just two examples of where people aren't, I mean, the research is there and it's actionable, but they don't want to look at it.
Yeah, I can't, because I don't work in HR, so I don't know. I mean, I know they have a rubric that they use that they developed with researchers some years ago, maybe as many as 8 years ago.
That's a Danielson hybrid.
Right, exactly. And I do know that we ask, I used to work on the school experience survey, now I no longer do because I'm directing this evaluation team, but we would ask, how useful is this process to you? This, I think it's called the teacher support something. And we did not get any notion that it was useful to the teachers, that they found it useful at all. So we provide that information to HR and say, okay, here are the findings. I mean, it's not, it isn't university-based research, but it's pretty clear.
Well, good for you for doing surveys of parents and students and teachers. That is, New York City has been very good about that too, really just asking everyone about these things and then hopefully putting them to work, but you're pointing to a situation where it wasn't listened to.
Yeah, we had another, if you aggregate the data by ethnic groups, you see that our African-American students are feel very disrespected on campus, do not feel like their teachers care about them. And so, and we're like, oh yeah, we're all about equity. We're all about equity, but yet these numbers haven't changed since I started looking at them in 2012. And they haven't changed, they're just the same. So
sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, Kathy.
No, go ahead. I don't feel like I said I'll talk as much as you want, but you may not want me to talk about.
Well, one of the things that's coming up in some of these comments is that link between local data and research. And so I'm wondering if you guys agree. One of those things we found in our data, right, was when external research was used, it was almost always used with local data, right? That there is some importance of considering that external research with other local information. Would you say that's true, that's an important way of making or thinking about that compatibility piece?
Is that for me? That question for me or for anybody?
Everyone, anyone.
Well,
Christine, I'm sure as a practicing superintendent, you have some thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's what I was, yes. I mean, I think that when we talked about kind of building the context around the research as well, and someone had mentioned earlier, the question that often comes up, but well, what does that look like for our students? And what does that look like for our community? And I think even in the example that you gave before, Kim, regarding the starting school at 8:30, right? That is absolutely, we have had more over all the years I've been in education, more meetings together to talk about, how do we make that happen? How do we schedule and how do we do that? So I think using the more we try to influence the use of local data, if it's not already being used with research. And we did a lot of that, or we started that work before I left too, around acceleration versus remediation at the department. And that's very new out there with people as well, just understanding acceleration. And then, some of the remedial work that's been done. And we were trying to use actual data from different LEAs that were specifically using acceleration strategies to kind of show that. So it's almost that seeing is believing. So using real data from places that people can relate to, whether it's their own or very near to them, like neighboring districts and charters, is always helpful for educators, in my opinion.
Raya, I would be very interested in your experience with teacher evaluation. How's that gone for you and your colleagues?
It feels very subjective to a lot of extent. I know we use what's called the JPAS, which is a Jordan district. So it's out of Salt Lake, but it compares to Danielson. For me, as somebody who's been practicing and a pretty decent teacher, I don't get any helpful information from it. There's no guidance on growth, I would say, for it, just because I start out on everything, right? I mean, that's just where I'm at. There's no area of improvement. I know teachers that need help don't always get it based on the Danielson framework because it just, I don't know, it's not being in the trenches every day. We call it the dog and pony show, right, Kim? And we don't want it to be the dog and pony show, but that is what you put on when you're being evaluated because that's how it is. So if it was based on a different method, I think it would be more helpful to growth as a professional. So yeah, it has not been helpful.
That's so discouraging to hear that. And there are examples in some schools, some charter schools, some regular public schools that are really doing things differently with that. So I want to talk about something that's sort of close to my heart. I'm right in the middle of reading the third edition of Doug Lemav's book, Teach Like a Champion. It's 3.0. Now, this is something that many educational researchers would look down their noses at. Like, is this educational research? Really? You know, this guy has gone in and videotaped classes and written up 63 specific techniques, you know, for sending students to college. But I think Lemav's work is some of the most extraordinary work that exists in our field. John Safir was the sort of the pioneer of this, you know, 50 years ago with The Skillful Teacher. And there have been other attempts to sort of deconstruct teaching. I think Lemav has done a superb job. And by the way, this third edition is significantly revised. They've really looked at race and equity. They've looked at rejiggered, and they have 100. So you can talk about a specific technique, and then you can watch a video of a teacher doing it. Now that is amazing. But again, I bet a lot of the researchers think this is like really not really research. I'd be interested in other people's reaction to that. What do people think of Lemav's work? Christine, you are nodding. Are you using that in your district?
So we've definitely done several book studies on Lemav's work, but we're also, as a state, implementing a brand new teacher evaluation system, and we're working with John Safir on that. So it's the Delaware Teacher Growth and Support System. So it's all looking more at different elements, and rather than teacher-centered, it's student-centered, and it provides that feedback for teacher growth. So rather than an evaluation system, it's a growth system and how you continue to grow as an educator. So I'm really excited, having left starting the work at DOE, now coming in as a superintendent. I have 6 schools that will be piloting this coming year. So I'm really excited to see how that rolls out within a district. So just wanted to throw that out for anyone, but John Safir is the one who's been working with us as a state. So
interesting.
Jump in here. You know, when you're talking, Kim, about the videos and things, it reminds me of the actionability. You know, and I'm not familiar with Lemav's work, so I can't speak to, you know, whether it's research or not. But you know, on the slides that we shared with you earlier, we shared some examples that we heard from practitioners in our case studies about what they view as actionability. One quote, for example, was, does it have classroom examples? Does it have, you know, this is what you can try. Think about this, ask this question. We really want to start the motivation. And if you have to make up too much, it's too much interpretation. So that was one educator's perspective of what actionability was to them. So I want to turn that question back to you guys. And ask you, what makes something actionable? Like, very, you know, specifically, when you're looking at a piece of research, what makes something actionable for your purposes? And anyone can feel free to respond.
I'll start with the concept right now of sight words. So it's very specific. It is the initial Dolch words, the Fry list, what we were initially trained at is non-decodable, which tons of words on the list are decodable, don't really align to what's in an appropriate text of that age level is a big thing right now. And that is very, very classroom actionable, right? That is exactly like how we teach phonics with reading and everything else that we're doing. And so that's something that we have local control of in our classroom. We don't really need a district level person coming in and telling us what to do with that. Once you have that information, you can instantly implement how we're approaching the concept of sight words. Would be one specific thing that I'm dealing with, like currently. School's ending tomorrow. We're currently thinking about next year and what we're going to do.
One of the things that really intrigues me is the role of background knowledge in reading. And that's really not been discussed too much in the current science of reading debate. In an article I did a couple of weeks ago in the Memo, there was a passage describing a cricket match and using all kinds of British sort of cricket language that was completely incomprehensible to an American who, unless they happen to know about cricket. And yet you could read every word, you could decode and read every word in the sentence. And the role of background knowledge is huge. And I think one of the things I'm really tracking is how are reading programs writ large, the whole program that you adopt. I mean, you don't want teachers just going to Pinterest and sort of making up stuff as they go along, although some people can do that brilliantly. Still, most people want to have at least a basic program. How well are the new programs doing at incorporating background knowledge and really building? I'm a big fan of E.D. Hirsch. I think his work on core knowledge is amazing. And actually for my 2 grandchildren, we have the new editions of the what your kindergartner needs to know, what your second grader needs to know. You're smiling, Ray. I think you're familiar with these books. And they're, I mean, right down to idiomatic expressions, just being really systematic, because some kids get this at home and some kids do not. And the school is really in the position here of being systematic and making sure you don't want a kid arriving in 12th grade, never having heard about the Holocaust, or never having read about Tulsa, or never having read about immigration or some other critical topic, or just vocabulary in the English language.
I would argue that maybe the challenge is really recognizing what assets the background knowledge that our kids bring from wherever they come have, and how we learn how to incorporate that and build on that into our pedagogy. I mean, I once interviewed a teacher and asked about the English learner's background knowledge, and she said, "Oh, this child has no background knowledge." And I'm thinking, okay, they're in a Petri dish and they just get dumped on the schoolhouse steps when they're 5 years old, and it's up to you to create what happens in their brain all by yourself. But there is that attitude. There is, and I believe that we still have that issue, which we're working on a strategic plan now. And I'm saying, look, we have to change teachers' attitudes about our students, because still most of our teachers are white and most of our kids are Black and brown. And what they bring to the classroom, they have tremendous assets, and we just fix them, trying to turn them into us, which we're not so great. So I don't even know why we bother. But that is a point that I think is really, background knowledge is huge, but it needs to be recognized that it's their background knowledge.
Well, I agree that that's part of being a culturally competent teacher. However, if we do not teach children the language of power, we are doing them a disservice.
Well, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, are the external research partners that you guys have, do they provide things that are actionable, or how do they support actionability of their findings?
We've never done the research to see if we demand and sometimes get the infographic that goes along with it. And a lot of researchers would love the opportunity to be able to present to teachers, to the people that they study, to administrators, but there's, it's got to be taken up by somebody, and that's not widely happening. Now, we do have a research practice partner, Los Angeles Education Research Institute, which works with our data, has all of our data. We have a lot of trust with these folks. We've been with them for 10 years, and they do make presentations, quarterly presentations, which are taken up and acted upon.
So one of the prime examples of a really effective research partnership is in Chicago Public Schools, the Chicago Consortium. And Karen Chenoweth's new book, Districts That Succeed, an absolutely extraordinary and very, very important book, talks about the fact that who knew that the Chicago Public Schools, once regarded as the worst in the country. In 1987, William Bennett, the Secretary of Education, went there and said, this is the worst public school district in the country. Over a period of 15 years, the Chicago Public Schools made more significant gains than almost any other district in the country. Who knew? Now, it did plateau a few years ago, and the plateau has been, excuse me, the pandemic has been devastating. But Karen Chenoweth's book talks about one of the main factors being a University of Illinois Chicago consortium. I'm blanking on his name. Someone help me out. Who's the name of the key researcher? Light? Help me out someone.
Break.
Tony Bright.
Right, Tony Bright, thank you. Has done an extraordinary job of translating research and bringing it right down to the classroom level, really listening to teachers, trying things out, experimenting, constantly changing. And really, I think the main statistic is the kids did 6 years of learning in 5 years. I mean, it was a very incredible and important acceleration. A lot of it had to do with teacher training, principal selection, school ethos, professional learning communities. It was a whole bunch of stuff that happened in Chicago, mainly as a result of a research consortium. So that's a real success story.
I love the job you've created for yourself, Kim. You just get to read research all the time and then decide what you think is worthy of sharing and then share it. But you get the opportunity. That's your job, day in and day out. That you get to read and read and read, right?
It's actually 2 days. So I read on Sunday, about 8 hours of reading on Sunday. I read through the pile that's come in, and then on Monday I write. And then I'm on the road. I mean, I try to get into schools and work with principals and districts around, to keep myself honest, because I've got to know. Plus, I have 2 children who are teachers who are also giving me the lowdown on a regular basis. And my coach is an education lawyer who so far has kept me out of trouble. So, but thank you. Yes, I have carved out an interesting role for myself here. And it does, I mean, you alluded to this in what you just said, it does depend on my judgment. And really, it's 52 years, in schools as a teacher and otherwise. But I listen for challenges. I always send stuff to authors. Did I get it right? Did I summarize your work honestly? But then it's the selection, because I'm only choosing, 10 articles out of 150 articles. So am I choosing the right ones? And that's where the judgment comes in. I hope I'm doing it well.
Kim, I'm sorry.
No, go
I
ahead,
was just going to
Christine.
say, Kim, I think what you just said hit the nail on the head. You're out in schools and working with people and seeing what's happening. And I think in all of our positions, no matter where we are, what makes research more actionable innately will be when, as researchers, whether it's the researchers that are here today listening to the panel or all of us at researchers in our field, the more we're out there with the people that we're researching about, innately our research is going to become more actionable, because we're then going to be looking for very specific things, writing them in a specific way that will have more impact when they come out. So I just, I know from every job I've had has been just a little bit further away from the classroom. So you have to make that much more of an attempt to be there, to make sure the decisions you're making, just like the research that you're putting out, is very applicable to the audience that you're writing it for in reality.
Yeah.
So Christine just beautifully transitioned us to what the next section of our conversation today, which was I invited all of our panelists to have a look at our Jamboard that we created. Now, I know we all saw it earlier. I'm going to pull it back up, but I asked them to have a look at it in advance. Now, I know it's been evolving during this conversation. There's a few more things up there. These are our research community ideas and suggestions about how to be actionable or compatible, right? Which is really what Christine was just getting at, right? How can you make it actionable? So here are the ideas from various members of the SRI community and beyond. I will say I did integrate SRI posts with IEF posts. And so I'd love to ask the panelists to reflect on a couple of the posts and share your thoughts on that strategy or that idea. I'm going to pick on Kim first because I haven't picked on him directly yet.
Okay. So what, again, what's the question?
Are there, and it doesn't have to start with you, are there any of the posts on this Jamboard that stand out to you as either particularly good or maybe not very helpful suggestions for making research more actionable or compatible for leaders and educators as they work to improve what's going on in schools?
So reading between the lines of several of these posts here, I would say one of the issues is that researchers mostly write for other researchers. And because of that, they're using language, charts, Greek letters, graphs, and length that is really inaccessible to most school people. I'm not saying school people couldn't understand it, but the question is, will you as the practicing principal or superintendent, will you read a 42-page research article? Will you read a 35-page study? Will you even subscribe to that publication? I mean, I spend $5,000 a year subscribing to these publications because some of them are really expensive. And, so that's really a problem. And so that's where the translation comes in. That's my role, the role of other people who do this kind of work. The brokering is how can you take a 42-page article, get the main ideas, put them in a format that is accessible to a superintendent, to a principal, to an instructional coach, to a lead teacher, so they can say, aha, okay, so that's a good idea, because they're simply not going to read the research article. That's just a fact. So the brokers and these in-between people really play a critical role here. And then there's the question of selection too, because there are hundreds and hundreds of research articles. I mean, I subscribe to 60 publications and I'm only subscribing to a small percentage of the stuff that's out there. So I depend upon, and then there's the whole online world. There's all the tweets and the Facebook pages and the other Instagram things that are going on that I'm not even taking part in. I'm completely staying away from those, but sometimes people will alert me, especially my daughter. So there's a real disconnect here, a huge problem. And the burden cannot be on the people in schools who are extremely busy doing the daily work of keeping their schools running and safe.
Great comment. Others panel, I know you've been looking at this. Are there ones that you would react to? And no piggybacking on Kim. You got to pick something new.
So I feel like I may be repeating myself, but a couple that I picked out was target results to needs. So again, making sure the research is very targeted. I really, as educators, we just don't want to get to the end of a brief and go, so now what? Like it has to be very, like what was, what are we getting from that research that we can implement? And maybe, another piece too, and I noticed from on here, like to make it applicable too, is where do we see the results of that research in practice somewhere? Again, it goes back to that, more that anecdotal, that, some type of scenario, something. Where do we see those results in action? And I think that's what, we're looking for. We don't want to reinvent the wheel, and we do that a lot. So like, what can we do where we see it working and learn from that?
What do you do when somebody tells you all the research says? And I'm sure what you say is, okay, show me the research. Show me chapter and verse.
Well, I thought about when I got my homework yesterday that I was supposed to be prepared today, that I really did think about putting people at the table, putting the researchers and the practitioners at the table and co-creating what it is that they need to be researching. And I know that everybody's so busy. Teachers are slammed, principals are slammed, everybody is working as hard as they can. And so who has the time? I think I mentioned it before, we don't have time to reflect. That's why I'm not crazy about less prose, more graphics, one-pagers are best. Do we find what I've had teachers tell me, just give me the recipe. Just tell me what to do and I'll do it. It's not the kind of attitude that I would like to hear from teachers, because we're in the education business. We're in the, using our brains business. So when do we honor that? The deep thinking that we need to do about our practice and the changes to our practice that we really have to do to improve. We can't get the recipes and then just go and just go do it. We have to become active participants in our own growth and change. And so that's why I thought that was a really important one. And then one for me is that I've never actually studied, and maybe I can find a way to do that, where our research goes. All this, like I said, I had 1,000 proposals since the year 2015. Is it just help people get their EDD so they can be called doctor, which is a lot of what happens among the people that are trying to, and they, their programs are not strong programs and their professors are not researchers. So the work that they do, my only hope is that when I approve a dissertation research, that makes that person a better practitioner. that the work that they do through their program and through their research makes them better at their job. But that's just my desire. But really, my takeaway from this is I need to really be more systematic about where does this research go and how does it get used, other than just articles that Kim may or may not get to read down the line.
You know, I'm worried that if there are educational researchers on this call, that they're bordering on depression at this point, because we're sort of being so action oriented. I really think there is a role for basic research. There is a role for stuff that doesn't seem relevant right now, but over the years, as researchers talk to researchers and refine their methods and so forth, it becomes something like an aha moment, you know, somewhere down the road. So let's not put down research too much. I mean, I know the focus today is actionability, but there is a lot of important work in all fields that's going on that doesn't seem really relevant right now. That seems very arcane, you know, very abstruse, very abstract. And yet someday it may pay off. And someone's doctoral dissertation or somebody's study, you know, that's 60 pages long and has a lot of Greek letters, you know, may actually lead to some kind of breakthrough and some kind of insights.
Well, oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, when I was looking through the Jamboards and just thinking about research in general with this, because I think that Liz, the researchers put these questions on right from last time. What's interesting is teachers, we do this as our profession, right? We get paid for it, but you have to have like a certain amount of interest in what we do, or we couldn't work with the kids every day, because it just wouldn't happen. So we get excited pretty easily about things that excite us. And I think that's what's fun about what comes out of research is we may not have ever thought about something before, just because we are in the trenches and we get so, you know, like day to day, okay, it's time for this. And then there's this, and then you have these kids are absent, you're having to read, it's just all the things that are piled on us. But then when something comes out that is exciting or new or something innovative or something that sparks us as learners, I think it's very motivating and very exciting when you find that piece. Going back to what Kim said though, finding the pieces sometimes doesn't always happen. But I think as colleagues with the PLC model, having those professional conversations frequently and often, not just about student data, because I think we 100% are data driven, but having those exciting professional changes that happen is keeps us going when we're in the trenches. So I would say that's just an overall piece of when I read that.
If I could take myself and time travel back to when I was a sixth grade teacher in Boston Middle School in the 1970s, and if we could have heard about the idea of the PLC, there were 10 of us. There were 10 sixth grade teachers, all self-contained in an inner city middle school, Martin Luther King School here in Boston. And if we had the concept of sitting down together, the 10 of us, and looking at a common math test that we had all given based on 5 or 6 weeks of instruction, and really looking at each other and saying, you know, Bob Sweeney, this nerdy teacher next door to me, who I really didn't like very much and everything, but Bob, your kids are doing better than mine on this. What are you doing? And Bob has got some really neat idea, but his kids are not doing as well on the writing part of it, the open-ended questions. And so he talks to me and we look at Paul Casilli across the hall. And I mean, that would have been revolutionary. It would have absolutely changed the way we taught and changed our students' achievement dramatically. So that's, I think, the PLC idea, which is much perverted and much bastardized around the country, but in its purest form, teachers looking together at common writing projects, work that their students have done, and really having the time and the safety, the psychological safety, in the team to talk about it. That's a really exciting idea. I wish we'd had it back then.
I wanted to, very well said, instructional rounds, everything, like all this, having the time to really look and hone your craft is so important in education. But the one piece I was going to jump in real quick after Kathy, she talked about who should be at the table. I think the one group that we often forget, but has a major impact on education, and this is where some of Raya's frustrations may come from too, when there are certain things they'd like to do and can't do, or time to do, et cetera, is I think our legislators are a big part that should be consumers of a lot of this research as well. They are the ones that are writing and passing legislation and regulations, and those guide, having worked at the department, I can tell you, guide the majority of what we do in our schools. So I think the more we can continue to share and make it very clear. We have legislators that are very interested in, helping to advance education and need the right research and people to work with them so that the practitioner, the researcher, and the legislator are all together helping to make decisions for education. And I think that's where we'll see more power and actionability as well.
A great point, Christine. Thank you for sharing that. This has been a really great discussion. We've heard a lot about, how we can do better as researchers at, making things actionable through co-creation or, creating things that are more concise and infographics and things like that. But one of the final questions that we wanted to ask is, we really want researchers to be able to leave today with ideas about how to better meet your needs. So I'm going to ask the panel, what is one recommendation you would have for researchers? What's one action for us to take in order to better meet your needs? And that's posed to any one of the panelists. I know it's a big question, but
Well, I'll just jump in with my favorite topic would be to say clearly and definitively that value-added evaluation of teachers using test scores to evaluate teachers is a discredited idea. It doesn't work. It's unfair to teachers, and it should be banned in all school districts. And unfortunately, a lot of districts haven't really picked up on that research insight, which is very clear. I mean, there's a lot of research on this. And I think just speaking up courageously on a controversial issue like that so that people can turn the corner, get away from that. Now, I do agree, and Obama didn't have the wrong idea, which is it is all about student learning. I mean, if they haven't learned it, you haven't really taught it, or at least the system is not working well. So you do need to talk about student learning, but not making this critical mistake of using test scores as part of teachers' evaluation. It has to be much more local, micro, and medium stake student learning, like an exit ticket, like evidence of learning in a lesson, like a teacher team sitting, looking together at a common writing assessment, a project, a performance task, looking at that kind of learning when there's still time to do something about it, to change the actual result. But I think if researchers can just step out and say, to the Delaware, legislature, just this is not a good idea. This is a discredited idea. Let's move on and let's talk about student learning, but let's do teacher evaluation in a much more effective way so the teachers grow and learn and get better. And also get praised and appreciated for the good work they're doing every day.
And paid more.
Ah, yes, amen. Yes, there's researchers, all the research shows, right?
I'm going to cheat. I'm going to cheat.
The trap of merit pay. There's another.
Oh, yeah.
Merit pay is a very poor idea.
I'm going to cheat a little bit on mine. I just saw a post-it come up, and that's pretty much where I was going with this. I love the idea, the recommendation, what not to do, as well as what to do. A lot of times when you're reading research, and again, as an educator, teacher, administrator, whomever, it seems like another thing that we need to make sure that we're implementing and doing right. So like, what do we take off and what do we put on? And again, I want to reiterate what Kim said before too. It's just the appreciation for all of the researchers that are on today for the work they're doing, because it's so very important that we are using research and evidence-based practices in our schools. So that work is highly appreciated.
And by the way, they're hanging in there. I've seen that the 26 participants has not changed. So everybody is asleep and haven't logged off, or they're really still listening, which is great.
We haven't scared them off yet, so that's good.
I don't know, and maybe somebody on the panel could tell me, has there been much research done on the elementary? So I would say probably from the age of 3 to 12 on general exposure to things, meaning, I know you talked about background knowledge, Kim, but what I'm talking about is with the volume of standards that we have in an educational day, here's our day, and then you have things that happen throughout the day, lunch, recess, bathroom breaks, Band-Aids, social emotional learning, science, social studies, art, music, PE, computer, all the stuff, plus the two biggies, reading and math, how you possibly fit that into our instructional day to be the most effective. And I don't know if that's been looked at to say, not just time-wise, but also quality, There's a lot of variables in educational research. I know, because just quality of a teacher, myself compared to a first year special ed teacher is going to be very, very different. But I don't know if anything like that has been looked at. But just like what Christine was saying, there's so much put on our plate, and we want to give quality instruction for the benefit of our kids. And I know that when they hit middle school, then they have those classes that they specifically go to, but it's different when they're with one of us all day. And I'm not saying SPED, just in a general education setting.
I would chime in and say that this may not be a research question as much as a common sense question, which is, if you've got all these things you mentioned, plus, by the way, active shooter drills and everything else, you got to integrate. And so that's where social studies, science, and reading come together in an integrated curriculum. Schema, I guess, is the big word. I mean, get your schema going. And so if you're just doing it cookie cutters, subject by subject, you will go crazy. But I think one of the biggest mistakes of the last few years is minimizing science and social studies in the interest of improving reading, whereas actually the science and social studies knowledge is an integral part of becoming a better reader. So integration, I would say, is a big idea there that may not be a research study, but may just be a school using its its common sense and figuring out how to do that.
Sometimes I feel like if the researchers don't tell us it's a good idea, we don't think our common sense is good enough.
Really? So we have such low self-esteem that we.
I'm just saying, I mean, integrated instruction is like kind of a no duh, and yet you get a lot of pushback, like, because teachers think it's too much work.
So I mentioned that I was a self-contained sixth grade teacher, which is very unusual in middle school to have self-contained sixth grades. But I think that's, and actually there has been research on that platooning, that doing, separate reading, math, social studies, science teachers in elementary schools is not a good idea. Perhaps partly because of the integration problem. Because as a sixth grade teacher, having the kids almost all day, I was able to integrate things together. Whereas if I had been, taking one class, five different classes, every 45 minutes, it would have been much more difficult to do that.
So Kathy, we're gonna need your recommendation. And Ray, I'm not totally sure what your recommendation for researchers, so I'm gonna push back on you too.
So recommendation to make the research actionable, is that the task at hand? Okay.
To help researchers better meet your collective needs. And I realize all of your needs are different, but that's why we have all of you.
Well, and there's competing research findings, and that's gets a little confusing sometimes. So I'm definitely going to encourage my district to sign on to the Marshall memo, because he's going to figure it out for us, and we really appreciate that. We really do. But I think the research, I'd like to see it to go in the direction of the big ideas. And one big idea is this move the first grade curriculum to the kindergarten, and the kindergarten curriculum to early childhood. And what I see in the field is we're killing children's desire to learn. And I don't know if it's in the research someplace, I'm sure it is, but I haven't seen it, where, a 4-year-old, you can't shut a 4-year-old up. They are so interested in everything. They want to learn about everything. By the time they get to third grade, it's like it's all boring. It stopped being fun. It stopped being engaging. And to me, that is like the big question that we need to answer, because certainly by the time they get to middle school, we've lost them. And, yes, there's those teachers that are special and different and kind of really make a difference in a child's life, but I don't think there's enough of them. And so how do we as a system really look at what we're doing to children in our well-meaning desire to make sure that they're well educated, which, by the way, they're not, because we've turned them off. So that's what I would like researchers to do, is help us look at that, understand it, and change the way we're doing it.
That is a big idea. Doug Lemov talks about the J factor, the joy factor. And I certainly agree with not pushing down curriculum beyond the level of developmentally appropriate in the lower grades, and keeping it joyful, keeping it interesting, keeping it more project-based. There's a whole group in the George Lucas Foundation, the Edutopia group, that is working on project-based learning.
Yeah, I work with one of those researchers. She's very good.
Oh, really? Really? Is it DeVivo?
Ana Saavedra is the one I've been working with.
Ah, okay. Now they're doing some really good work out there, and George Lucas is amazing and put millions and millions of dollars into it. But I think bringing back the joy while also making sure that we have equity and you know, knowledge and skills and so forth. That is the big question. And I'm not sure how many researchers. Again, researchers can be very, very narrow. Hey, how many researchers are given permission to ask those very big questions? And if they're popularizers, are they looked down on? I mean, for example, someone like Daniel Willingham at the University of Virginia, absolutely amazing generalist, who did some wonderful, wonderful stuff. I do a lot of his stuff in the Marshall Memo. You know, I wonder how his esteem level is among educators because he's so popular. He's so accessible. He's so wonderful. Let's see, who's the researcher at Harvard, the professional learning communities researcher, who was so effective at this kind of work. Not Lightfoot. No, I'm sorry. Someone's gonna have to help me with this. I'm having a bad memory day.
I won't be able to help you out. You could just keep going.
And we'll look it up. We'll figure it out. Yeah.
Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot is one person.
Oh yeah, yeah, sure.
So I would like to use the rest of our time to open it up to questions and comments. Now, for our participants and our panelists, I told the panelists this before we came, we don't often have a chance to hear from panelists, right? They don't get to ask the audience questions. And so I just want to encourage everyone, this last few minutes can be a two-way dialogue. If there are any questions, panelists feel free to ask them as well, or audience feel free to ask them. This is our chance. So I'll open it up to questions right now.
You want to unshare your screen so we can see better?
Oh yeah, thank you. Excellent suggestion. Raya, have you got a question?
Yeah,
Go
I have a
ahead.
question if any of the researchers want to say, how do they imagine that their research gets to us in the classroom?
Ooh, I love that question. That is like a great carry through from our last session too. I hope someone's in chat on that, or go ahead and raise your hand or unmute. Probably easier to just unmute at this point.
I want to let somebody else chime in, but I have an answer. So I do a lot of, here, I'll turn on video too. I do a lot of research on program impacts. And so I rely on essentially media. So EdWeek, Chalkbeat, other outlets. And then beyond that, in terms of the sort of broader impact of the research that I do that sort of suggests that particular strategies work better than others, I sort of that sort of, I expect it to sort of amalgamate over time, and it ends up being repackaged not just as little tidbits of, oh, this strategy works, but as products that are specifically targeting practitioners. So it's either PD materials, it's books, but it's things that give you a broader picture of, here are some things that work well. That's sort of the way I see a lot of the knowledge that's generated from research that I do and others that do the kind of research that I do, making its way into practice. And sometimes when it's an impact evaluation and you say, yeah, it worked great, or no, it didn't work well, the impacts are relatively quickly because you can see districts deciding to either adopt or to drop something. On the other hand, when it's a strategy, it's a broader perspective, that information can take a lot longer to make its way into classroom practice.
Well, Henry, while we've got you here, people may know that Henry May has a study that has been all over the internet about reading recovery, quite controversial. And it happens that there are some very skillful advocates, Emily Hanford in particular, is a journalist who picked right up on that because she agreed with what she thought you were saying. And it may have been distorted. Do you want to take this opportunity to clarify or say something about that?
Yeah, so Emily actually approached me before the results were public, and had asked me, can you give me a sneak peek? And I was like, well, she's either going to take this information after it's totally public, and she's going to completely run with it with her own agenda, or perhaps she and I can have a conversation early, and I can sort of make sure that she gets the full message out there. I think she actually did a pretty good job of presenting it in a balanced way. It's undeniable the impacts in the long-term study were negative, which does not bode well for the intervention, but that there are multiple interpretations for that. And I think that she did a pretty good job of, although it's clear she thinks there's one interpretation and that's the program's harmful, that she does acknowledge that there are other possible interpretations.
Now, of course, there have been other studies that show the opposite. And also you had a very small sample. Not all the kids finished reading recovery. I mean, there are lots of fun.
Most of the other long-term studies of reading recovery use really small samples. The designs are matched comparison designs, so they're not very rigorous. This is the first design that's actually used a rigorous evaluation design, regression discontinuity specifically, but it's really complicated. It's not like a randomized experiment where you can just say, oh, it's a treatment and control group and they're equivalent before the intervention is delivered. It's not that simple. It's far more complicated than that. But we've got nearly, anywhere from 5,000 to 9,000 kids in our analyses. So these are huge samples, and we've analyzed the data many different ways using many different strategies and keep getting the same answer. And so it's like, no matter who approaches this with whatever complaint they have, we've looked at it that way. We still keep getting the same answer.
How many kids actually the program went all the way through?
So in our analyses, we don't pay attention to that. We do intent to treat analyses. So if you were supposed to have received it, we count you as being in the treatment group. And so this whole argument that, oh, we're looking only at those kids who successfully completed the intervention, that doesn't apply to our analyses. We look at everybody regardless of whether they received it or not.
The fatal flaw.
So I want to jump in.
Recovery advocates
I'm going to cut Henry off.
Yeah, go for it.
I could talk about this, and there's really interesting information to be had about this particular project, and it's really salient and a nice illustration of some of the things we're talking in this series. I do want to acknowledge there's a couple of comments in response to that question. Raya, thank you for asking it. Some folks mentioned curricula or textbooks for teacher education are one way that research may find its way to educators. And Betsy in the mentioned social media, website repositories. I'm not going to talk about it now, but part of our work did look at where educators reported going for research and where researchers reported sharing their research. So you'll have to stay tuned for that spiderweb graphic that's going to come out, but we'll have more to talk about there. We are just about at time, and so I want to thank all of our panelists so very much for taking time out of your day. You met with us prior to, you shared such great insights. You have really offered us a lot to think about and responded to those posts in ways that I think are really useful for our audience. I want to thank the participants for joining us. I know it's a busy time of year. Everyone's starting to think sunshine and summer. And so being here really demonstrates your commitment to working closer with our practice partners. And of course to Sri for collaborating with us on this project. Thank you to Katie for co-facilitating. We do have one more session for our participants. We have it in 2 weeks, and that's going to be looking at working with intermediaries as a way to sort of amplify and better your work, right? So a little bit building on Raya's last question here. See, everyone's just teeing us off beautifully. I love it. And thank you all for being here again to the panelists, and we'll see you soon.